such an extensive topic, we need to tag team by 3 people. Basically, we're talking about evidence-based practices. And it's sort of like a teacher's guide. At the end of this project, you will be able to know what evidence-based practices are, what are approved sources of evidence, find evidence for your intervention, assess the utility of evidence that you've located, understand how you might use evidence. It seems like the use of evidence would not be controversial, but it actually is within the nonprofit community. And there's more of the questions. Now, within the evidence-based practice, like a lot of stuff, started out under the medical model. Medicine started out as folk medicine, and people would discover certain things that may or may not have worked, and that they became part of the culture and were embedded in the culture and used. And starting in the 19th century, there was an emphasis on proving what worked in medicine and trying to raise the field. Evidence-based practice is most deeply embedded in medicine of all of the disciplines. Within the basic areas of the nonprofit community, social service types of interventions, evidence-based practice is much less embraced. And it would seem like that shouldn't be particularly controversial. That if what evidence is there for what works and relying on using things that have proven effectiveness seems like a no-brainer, but it isn't. Now, in terms of some kind of dictionary definitions, evidence-based practice is the preparation use of interventions for systematic empirical research to provide evidence of statistically significant effectiveness as treatments for specific problems. And in English, basically, evidence-based practice is what has the scientific research demonstrated works effectively. And I want to get to the enemies within both the philanthropic world and the basic nonprofit community. There are 2 big enemies of evidence-based practice. The first is current practice. Current practice typically consists of making the same mistakes year after year with increasing confidence and a resulting decreased need to make any improvements. I've been playing the guitar for 40 years. I have not learned anything new in 38 years. And I am no better today than I was 38 years ago. That's current practice. And when you look within the nonprofit world, there are all kinds of evidence, all kinds of examples of the supremacy of current practice. For example, when you look at after-school programs, all of you get, or, well, it depends on what you fund, but many of you get grant requests for academic enhancement in after-school programs. Don't work. Almost all of the research and evaluation efforts on academic enhancement in after-school time shows that the people who work in after-school programs are not trained in academic interventions. When they do academic interventions, they're typically enthused, committed, and totally ineffective. But no matter how much you give that research base to after-school programs, partly chasing dollars, because having fun in a safe environment is not something funders typically fund. They want to have something a little more measurable like enhanced academic achievement. Partly out of responding to funder needs, but also out of their own philosophical base. A lot of nonprofits will say, we know what works. We work with these kids, we know it works, but when you systematically study what it is that they're doing, it's ineffective. Typically, a lot of people who run nonprofits were trained in certain interventions. Most executives in nonprofits were line workers early in their career. They were trained with certain types of interventions. They liked them, they believed in them, and they promulgate them today, even though research and evaluation may show that they're not effective. An equally effective enemy of evidence-based practice is innovation. Innovation is highly overrated. Typically, being new, being different, being exciting, being sexy is what gets funded. Let me give you an example. This isn't something we funded, but something that attempted to get funded. Shortly after we opened our doors, we got a request to buy Beanie Babies for premature babies. Remember on the Beanie Baby craze? And the idea was that if you go way back to Harlow's research with the monkeys, they basically argued that premature babies don't get touched enough. So since they don't get touched enough, let's give them a Beanie Baby that they can snuggle with. And this was not a little $5,000 grant. This was a six-figure request. They wanted to buy baby beanies for Beanie Babies for all the premature babies, and a coordinator to make sure that Beanie Babies are being used properly, and because it was innovative. Well, innovative often means unproven and no demonstrable effectiveness. And it's also often quite political. When new administrations, whether it's a government administration or an agency administration comes in, one of the first things they want to do is throw out what the predecessor was doing and come in with their own strategic interventions. A good example is Mike Huckabee, when he was governor of Arkansas, had a really, really effective anti-obesity program. As soon as he was voted out, the program was thrown away because he had to come up with something new and different rather than sticking with what the previous administration had done. Not only is that in the world of government, but in agency politics, the same thing happens. When a new director of programs, a new executive director comes in, let's forget about what we've been doing before, and let's bring in new, exciting, innovative programs. The problem is, innovation makes sense when you don't have effective programs. When the stuff that has historically been done is of very limited impact, then think outside the box. It doesn't make a lot of sense to think outside the box when there are proven effective programs. Rather than funding Beanie Babies for to deal with the problems of the premature baby, we pay for more NICU beds. That's an effective, evidence-based practice as opposed to an innovation. Now, one of the things that a lot of agencies and a lot of philanthropies say is it takes too much work to study everything and figure out what really works, what's really effective, and what has evidence. The good news is the government does that. Government and some agencies do that for you. You've got a resource list here. At the bottom of the first section of the resource list, where it says sources for evidence-based practice in early childhood programs, says the What Works Clearinghouse. If you only know one website and you deal with kids, the What Works Clearinghouse is the gold standard. It's run by the U.S. Department of Education. It's not just early childhood, it's pre-K through 12th grade. And in order for them to say something works, it has to be a random controlled trial with multiple studies, with a very strong evidence base. If What Works Clearinghouse says it works, it's really effective. But whether you're dealing with youth and early childhood tend to have, and medicine, tend to have the most established evidence-based practices, which are documented for you. Older adults and some of the other areas don't have as much evidence-based practice. This is a good place to start. If somebody says, here's something that we're doing and it works and we want you to fund it, see if there's evidence that it works. These sites can answer that question for you. And if you have a specific population, what you need to do is, and it doesn't show up on this list, just Google the specific population, specific kind of intervention, and put in evidence-based practice. See what comes up. Now, a lot of these sites aren't as rigorous as the What Works Clearinghouse, but at least it will indicate how much research evidence there is that something is effective. Okay? Yeah. And this is basically what I was just talking about. The upside is governmental and nonprofit organizations have done this work for you. The work of establishing evidence-based practice is highly technical. It's looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the research studies and finding out not only whether or not it works, but who it works for. And that's one thing you need to keep in mind whenever you're doing it, looking at evidence-based practice. If there's an intervention for high school kids to keep them out of gangs that was validated in Baltimore, working with 16 to 18-year-old black kids, and you want to work with middle school Native American kids or middle school Hispanic kids, it may or may not work. But at least you'll know when you go to these websites, it'll tell you not only what is the evidence that works, what's the evidence that's effective, and who is it effective with. And then you can try and figure out the extent to which your population is close enough or real different from that it makes a reasonable expectation that if it worked there, it would work here.
So, building on that, thank you very much. We would like to walk you through an exercise considering evidence-based practice. So we thought we would just have a little fun with this. So first, let's consider the community issue. Before you have a piece of paper from the CDC talking about the burden of chronic disease in Arizona. So you, as a funder, you want to look for an innovative, and we're including both the enemy in here, and an evidence-based practice to help reduce hypertension and lower blood pressure. Well, you've decided to start to read journals, and you love the movie Willy Wonka, you love chocolate. You found out in Germany and in Italy there has been a research study by several doctors, and they determined that dark chocolate after eating, 20 minutes after eating, might make a difference in lowering blood pressure. So you're very excited because this is a big issue in Arizona and no one has really discussed this. So take the envelope in front of you. You have to wait 20 minutes after eating to see if this actually will help you, and we'll find out if you are in the treatment group or the control group. So we want to consider the theory of change as you consider your chocolate. So here we are with evidence-based practice. We want to think about what is the change that we're trying to have that occurs. So the community need is chronic disease. Our specific intervention, which we'll discuss a little further, will be your chocolate dosage and the type of chocolate that you will dose yourself with. The intended outcome is the reduction in hypertension, which then will reduce overall chronic disease. There are lots of statistics documenting the need. You have another sheet with some references and actually a study from WebEx MD, and I have the link, but I'm not going to bring it up, with some really elegant or lovely statistical modeling showing the documents, and we'll talk about this in a minute. And then evidence, your choice of the intervention and the cause-effect relationship. So will taking the chocolate reduce hypertension? So we want to talk about research first, and then we want to talk about the difference between research only and research as an evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice intervention describes activities that are supported by research. And so these are activities that there's a research base, a program may start to do something, And I think, as Wayne said when he was talking about youth programs, perhaps in Black communities in Baltimore, if they are replicated exactly, they may continue to work, and that's called fidelity to the program, and Bethany will speak a little more about that, I believe. But they may not work elsewhere, so there's cultural differences. So we want to see, does the evidence demonstrate that the intervention is likely to produce the intended outcome? Not good with these things. So let's look back at our case of chocolate. So I have hypertension, high blood pressure, I eat my dark chocolate, I will be healthy, I will live a longer life. Well, we'll talk about replication exactly. In the study, it was 30 ounces of dark chocolate per day. It was a population study of 30 calories. It's a Hershey's Kiss. 30 calories, sorry. So 30 calories, which is the size of a Hershey's Kiss. Well, you know, in America, we like things bigger and better. So you have two larger pieces of chocolate. So we'll think about replication in that model. So, but for the purposes of this study, which was produced in the Journal of American Medical Association, a top-notch journal, the population, the total people in the group that were picked, were 119 people. Out of those, and they were excluded, those with heart problems, those with this problem, those with that problem. So everyone in the study was a group of persons between 25 and 65. We're very healthy. They're Europeans, so they're walking everywhere, unlike suburban America. So they're in generally good health. And the sample size was 44, half with white chocolate or milk chocolate. And it was over an 18-month period that they studied this suggestion. So research suggests that taking the dark chocolate will solve the problem, but we haven't really looked at evaluating and the difference between research and evidence-based. So research-based does not equal evidence-based. Evidence-based is research plus rigorous testing, which Wayne talked about, the rigor of testing with random control groups, which is what you are here. We have a treatment group and a control group. So evidence supports that the specific intervention is going to produce your intended outcome. Dr. Tarbert, MD, PhD, this degree, that degree, and his other colleagues suggest this is important, as does another doctor in Italy. But we learned that when we consider the overall effect and the outcome, oh, it was 55 to 64, I'm sorry, that it really didn't make much of a difference, that the impact was really not that large, that the effect, when we go back to statistics, you want to talk about, is it statistically significant? What was the magnitude of the intervention, and how did the outcome differ? Well, in the actual study, they said, well, there was really little magnitude, but it was important nonetheless. And so we have two studies with a maximum total population of under 300, and less than 50% showed the difference in one clinical trial, two different clinical trials. So the evidence that you'll look at and from this list and elsewhere is really to give you a reality check. And so I think to go back to innovation as the enemy, if you want to fund an innovation program, it might not necessarily be an evidence-based program, because you would not have evidence, so it would be something experimental. So you have to think about the design and the dosage, and I think this goes back to the technical issue is, this is really tough stuff, and it's hard work, and it's, you know, you think, do we really need an expert? But again, I think you have a list of resources as well. And the Foundation Center also has less than what Works Clearinghouse, but they have it by design, and they break it out and give you practices. So you want to know, is there sufficient evidence to continue for the intervention? What modifications do we need to make, and should we choose a new intervention? So here we might want to modify sedentary Americans to 1 calorie of chocolate as opposed to 3 calories to see if that can work. So you should look for evidence that program models or interventions have been successful, and we'll talk about different methods with that, or Bethany will. So we combine the research with the evaluation to look at the outcomes and is there a specific impact. And then you want to see if, when it's replicated, if it's the same outcome again. And then after various tests, which Bethany will talk about the different models or of methods testing, then we can determine if it's of value. So what to look for? You want to make sure that it's relevant. Something when we talked about cultural differences versus maybe Baltimore versus a tribe, cultural differences as a European in this study versus an American. So we just have different lifestyles. Is the information compelling? Is it up to date? I'd like to point out the information I gave to you is not up to date. It is, it's not that old, but it's not that new. It's 5 to 7 years old. So we may have found a study just by me going through Google Scholar that says this is completely ridiculous. Chocolate does nothing but give you an emotional high. Not me, I was allergic to chocolate as a kid. It sent me to the hospital. But, so you want to make sure that it's up to date. So really anything that is 5 to 7 years out of date, think twice about relying on that. Who's the source? Who has an outcome? In this report, and even in the WebMD, they say there was no monies taken from private companies. So you want to make sure whoever is supporting the trial is not funding the trial. That's more so, I think, in medicine than having government-funded research, although there could be agendas there too, but no comment on that. So really what you want to do is make sure that the material studied in the article is relevant. Does it apply? Is it culturally appropriate for you and your program? And so necessarily moving from one program to another doesn't always work. Why is everyone so interested in evidence? Well, there's accountability. And so there's increased work on accountability for this. Recently, I can't think of her name, in the 2013 blueprint that just came out.
Lucy Barnholtz.
Thanks, yeah. She basically talked about the movement towards research and evidence and accountability in philanthropy. And she said that foundations have really driven this. The whole article really is about a movement away from traditional philanthropy, nonprofit networks to social entrepreneurship, crowdfunding, all of these new interventions, but that the lead for all of this has really been the data-driven change-making that foundations have read. Efficiency, research development costs with creating a new program. As Wayne said, there are a lot of really strong, rigorous, efficient models out there. The availability of good science. There is, again, critical mass. And also, there are lots of assistant professors who need tenure who would probably love to help you on your program right here at ASU. Marketability. How can this sell and justify the program? That's also good for the nonprofit or any organization that you're working with. And we haven't really spoken about, and maybe Wayne, you could address this at the end, communicating evidence, and if you are collaborating on with other organizations, either foundations or government, or even private business and supporting a cause. And then finally, ethics, using what is known to be effective and not promoting something else. So I think the thing to really take away in our case of chocolate is we have a research base here, and it's strong, but it's not proven. So it's not an evidence-based intervention. We have to remember, even though it's a fancy European study, that hopefully I would have had a trip if I were looking at this to both Germany and Italy, that what happens in place A doesn't necessarily apply to place B, and that modifications may happen to evidence-based programs, but you have to be careful about how you modify the program in order to make sure that the design is still strong. And then it may become something else. So back to enemy number 2, innovation. You were so thrilled about the chocolate that you funded, the Oompa Loompa programs, and you gave a never-ending supply of dark chocolates to a horde of chocoholics. So we really didn't consider the dosage because we thought more was better. So your folks now have reduced hypertension, but they're all overweight. So that gives you a new opportunity for funding. But once again, just to walk you through the difference that research alone does not necessarily mean that you have rigor and strength in the outcome for the program.
All right, so I'm up next, and you've got a very, very scary word up there, methodology. So before we go to that, I just wanted to pause and see if there's any questions or reflections or comments from the audience for any of us on the panel. Brian?
Was it okay to eat the chocolate?
Yes.
Mine disappeared.
I'm having my emotional high right now.
But Bethany, the trick would be to have dark chocolate and wine with it.
Wine, there probably are studies that have the red wine, not white. We could do that for the next clinical trial.
4 o'clock. I was warned that the bad.
This really isn't any more far-fetched than a lot of proposals that I've seen.
That's true. So that, I mean, it points to the idea that philanthropy has a role for elevating the whole field. For both, thinking about how you approach evidence as you assess grantees, but also talking to grantees about how they can present their evidence or go and get some evidence. Any other questions? Well, then I'm going to start on this leading topic of methodology. I think Patsy did a great job of describing sort of 4 broad criteria that you should keep in mind as you look at different research and evaluation studies. And I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper around sort of different qualities of evaluations, the methodology that underpins these different research studies. And so, remember the chocolate? Good feelings, even as I throw out big words to you. And the idea with these next couple slides is to introduce some more complex terminology and topics to you. We won't go in depth. If you want to understand it a bit better, I'm happy to be a resource to you. But at least when you start seeing some of these terms in studies as you look at them, you'll have a framework through which to interpret them. And so when I say methodology, it's really the research design. And we've talked a lot about effectiveness. So this is the ability of the research design to establish causation. How much did X intervention, the chocolate, a new teacher professional development program, a whole school reform effort, how much does that create whatever outcome that you're hoping to see? So how much confidence can you have in that? And I want to say up front, this whole idea of experimental designs, random assignment that we've already referenced, only works for certain types of philanthropic investments. There's a whole variety of strategies that you will all do and invest in to create change in your communities and in the individuals you care about that these kind of evaluation methods can apply to and shouldn't be applied to. So some of the ones you might see are advocacy, public will building, public interest litigation, diplomacy, grassroots convening. There's other activities you engage in that, while they can amass some evidence of whether or not they're having effectiveness, don't necessarily have a well-established hierarchy that I'm going to get to in the next slide. Even with that said, you can start looking at what kind of research and evaluations have been done on these types of evaluations. It just, there's not a nice, clear standards around how you interpret that evaluation or evidence base. A couple things to help you out as you might be looking at that. Actually, let me pause and take, how many of you invest in strategies like those listed in the second bullet on this page? How many? Okay. So is the remainder of the group actually investing in more innovations and programs? Yeah, okay. So the next couple slides will be more relevant to you. For the couple of people who are investing in some of these other strategies, there is some guidance to think about as you look at evaluation studies or research studies. One, does the researcher acknowledge and try to eliminate alternative explanations for how that outcome was achieved? So is it because of whatever the advocacy effort was of X organization, or could it have been broader changes that were occurring in the community? Does he acknowledge them and hopefully eliminate some of them so you have greater confidence that it was actually the organization or the strategy that was tried? The other thing is, do they build a systematic case in the, the last session we had was about logic models that United Way has kind of pioneered and helped build the field's capacity to use and think about. So in looking at a logic model, do they build the case along the way that they're actually producing at each step? And then you have a greater confidence that some intermediate steps, some outputs that they might have, is going to lead to that long-term outcome. And then the other really important thing when you're thinking about quality research or evaluation is the author honest with you about the limitations of their own study. Do they acknowledge some of the conclusions that's not appropriate to make based on their research? So those are just broad sort of lessons learned, cautions, or things to keep in mind as you look at these other studies. Luckily, for the majority of people in the room, there is a well-established hierarchy for thinking about more programmatic evidence. And as we've said time and time again, the What Works Clearinghouse is a great and is the gold standard for how we think about this, especially in the education field. So let me go on. This is where the scary words come in. So you'll hear about some buckets. We all talk about promising and proven programmatic investments, and that's sort of what you have here on the side. And I'm trying to correlate them to some of the broader buckets still on the other side that we talk about. So, promising is really about theory. Do you have that logic model? Do you have that theory of change? Do you have some data analysis to support it, some measurement to support it? And as you get further up, you have designs that are called quasi-experimentals. And then as you get a little bit more sophisticated, you have experimental designs, which is that random assignment of certain participants to either a control or a program group. And you have different, within each of these broader buckets, you have some different ways of approaching those kind of designs. So you see them listed out. I'm happy to field questions about what does that one mean, or we can do that offline. But just trying to segment out that not all evidence is created the same, and you should be giving different weight to different evidence. That said, this is a very simplistic, reductionist presentation of these different designs. And so you can have, and I have read, random assignment designs that are poorly executed that have some real methodological flaws in them. So it's just, general categories to keep in mind and filter through without being overly reliant on it. And it gets a little bit more complicated as we reference. Does it work? Sounds like a really simple question. And all of these different designs can help you answer that question. But you do have those sequel questions like, does it work for who? Over what time period? On what outcomes? And so as you think about the studies, you have to match up what they're saying and telling you about what's happened in the past with what you hope to fund in the future. So I'll pause there again, even with the scary words on the board, and ask if there's any questions. And I'm going to give you an example in the next slide about how you could see some of these differences actually play out.
Probably one of the most valuable things you mentioned was that What Works website. But if you're not looking in that particular area to check your evidence against, how do you know? I mean, we've all learned that everything you look up on the internet is not necessarily true. So how do you know if you're looking up in a good place?
Yes, no, that's a great point. And you're getting ahead of me in a couple slides, but I'll
Okay.
move there.
I'll
Just
wait.
because you're asking a question, I think it's a very valid one. Thankfully, there is the What Works Clearinghouse. There are other resources on that, and I recently handed out to some of you, if you don't have this, another resource guide that has other agencies or government groups putting out assessing evidence. And what's nice is there's sort of a shift within the field from typical literature reviews that just summarize a body of studies or a body of work within a given field to this idea of systematic reviews, where they're doing some of the judgment work for you. So they've got some clear criteria about what makes a good study, and then saying whether or not the studies meet those criteria. So that helps you do some of the work. Yes, there's going to be studies out there. I think going to a credible source, so government agencies, there's certain firms, think tanks, universities that add to the credibility. And I think being really clear about what the source is, and if you're reading a primary source versus somebody's secondary digested interpretation of a study is always better. If you get into really complex questions, try to tap somebody at your local university or within our network to help you assess how to think about that particular study.
Yeah, and one thing I want to throw out is if the person who's applying for a grant is the researcher, be much more cautious, because good research is independent. And in terms of evidence-based practice, what you're looking for is people who don't have skin in the game, who have reviewed the issues and say this works and this doesn't. Typically, even if it's a prestigious researcher from a prestigious institution, if the person looking for the money is the one doing the research, find other research that supports it.
Could you maybe describe how you use, when you review someone's proposal and then how they're going to do their methodology? At what point, I assume if it had no validity, you throw that out, but say it has some validity or something. So how much time do you invest, how much discussion, how much do you ask them to change, and do you have to have a certain funding relationship before you can require
That's
change to it?
a great question, and I think it gets, I want to pull up two different uses of evidence. One is just, do they make the case based on evidence-based practice of what they're proposing, and it should be like a summary introduction. The next step is then actually working with them to build additional evidence, which is I think what you bring, the question you bring up. And I think this is a decision each foundation or each funder needs to make based on the resources you have in-house. I can say how Helios is approaching it, and maybe some of our other panelists or other folks in the room can say how their foundations are handling it. But typically what we've started to do is as, you know, our general grantees come in with an evaluation, that's forwarded to me, and I review it and send back comments or have a call. But in the end, it's the grantee's relationship with the evaluator, and they get to decide the scope. We have input, we try to shape, but at a very light touch. In addition to that, we have some strategic initiatives, which Helios is engaging much more deeply with the grantee, both programmatically as well as on the evaluation. And that's me, as well as an external evaluator, sitting down with the program, our program, in-house Helios folks, as well as the grantee, to talk about what do you want to learn, what are you trying to achieve, some basic questions like that. What kind of program or strategies are you going to use, and then what's the best methodology to fit what you're trying to do, and to get the best evidence of that. So currently, in our strategic initiatives, we've had, you know, I think the most rigorous that we're shooting for is what I have here, comparative interrupted time series. But that's not what we're doing in year one. Year one is implementation work. It's looking at what's happening on the ground. Does it warrant something more rigorous on this list, warrant an effectiveness study? And that might happen in years 4 or 5 of the program. So it really depends. And the level of intensity depends both on your program officer, as well as the grantee, and as well as that third-party evaluator that you might bring in. So that's how we're thinking about it.
One thing that has an effect on the ability to do high-quality work here is how few or how many evaluators there are. And I would not say that was a deep pool in Metro Phoenix or in Arizona. Can you talk about that and how that pool might be strengthened?
Well, the first part is easier than the second part. One advantage of evidence-based practice, let me back up a little bit. The smaller the funder, the less likely they are to have evaluation staff in-house. And at the same time that they don't have evaluation staff in-house, they're often asking for evaluations from the grantees. One of the advantages of evidence-based practice is if they're taking an evidence-based practice and applying it to a similar population that the evidence-based practice is validated against, you don't have to prove it works. The evaluation becomes exceedingly simplified because rather than determining that it works, the evaluation consists of, was your implementation faithful to what was done in the research? That's a lot easier. It makes your life easier, it makes their life easier. You just, at the beginning of the grant, specify, these are the things that have to be done for the intervention to be faithful, and just track, where are you doing these things? And that's the whole evaluation, it makes everybody's life easier.
Yeah, and I would just add, in tracking, since we said, you know, generalizability, tracking demographics of the population that you're serving and making sure that those are similar to how the the population that was served by the intervention proven effective is really important. So you know, demographics of your population doesn't match. Tracking implementation, fidelity to implementation, and some outcomes, outputs could be enough. I will caution, I don't think there's a huge pool of those kinds that are out there to replicate. It's getting bigger, thankfully, because of investments on the part of the federal government and more rigorous evaluation, but it's small. To get to your point about the local capacity, it's something that I've experienced since I came to Arizona in the last year, 1-year anniversary, actually. And I think that we're figuring out strategies. One of the things that we're hoping to do at Helios is create even just a database of who's out there and their specialties to be able to increase that matching process between the grantees and evaluators that would be appropriate to them. But in terms of actually growing it more, I think it's something we have to think about, and hopefully maybe think about with our university partners, because U of A and ASU are big universities with research dollars. So there is a way to think about using them as a resource.
And I might add too, in the What Works Clearinghouse, there's a research to practice briefings, and I can send one to Marissa to put on the website. But there's an excellent one. They're real short. They're 3 to 5 pages about what to look for in replicating a model and what not to look for. So these are the things that, if they're minor things, if they're not being replicated, and then major differences. So that might also be a help, Rosemary, when you're looking to see in the beginning, and then they put it in a real, I think, a succinct, good order, and they talk about that, and it's a very handy tool, which is what's nice about that site, is that there are these research to practice, and they're written in plain English. They don't have these lovely words. They have some of them, but they're very handy tools. But that might be a good one for everyone.
Out of curiosity, how many of you in the room actually commission evaluations of your grantees or rely on them to do a third-party evaluation? So, okay. But you're more consumers of evidence and evaluation. That's good to know. Because this is resource intensive, all of these options. And as you get further up, your costs increase too. So I just wanted to use a little sort of case study about how evidence quality varies, or the kind of conclusions you can make based on certain evidence varies. So in this, you have 3 different studies around the same type of intervention, but with different evaluation approaches. And the first is your more typical performance measurement, which is probably what a lot of you are engaging in. So just tracking sort of the outcomes of a particular intervention, the Shape Up program, and whether the participants indicate healthier food choices in this case. And you have 75% of the girls doing so, which is good, 75% sounds good. But the trick is, how do you really interpret that? What would it have been in the absence of the program? And that's what researchers like to call, and you might find, the counterfactual. So what would have happened? Maybe the girls would have, they're getting older, they're thinking more about health, they're entering high school, and they're going to be making healthier choices anyways. Or it could have gone the other way. Maybe they're going to high school, and in their cafeteria there's nothing but chips. So it's hard to interpret the 75%. Is that good? Is that bad? In different ways of performance measurement does this is there a standard metric against which we should be shooting for? In the field, is there an accepted rate of 80% of choices are healthy? And that's what we should be aiming for, and that's the standard within the field. And there's some fields like welfare and job training programs that the field has come together and created some sort of benchmarks for particular populations. As you get a little bit more sophisticated in the next box, it actually creates a comparison group. So it takes the girls that are in the program and matches them. In this case, it's talking about propensity score matches. So it matches them on all measurable characteristics. So that would be, their race, their ethnicity, maybe even their grades, their prior behavior, and tries to match them with this comparison group that's pretty alike. And you're seeing a difference between the group that got the intervention, the program group, and this comparison group. The girls in the program make 50% more healthy choices. So you get a little bit more confidence that that difference is because of your program versus just some other variable. We live in complex society. So a little bit more confidence that the program is actually driving the change. Unfortunately, in this design, what it doesn't control for is unmeasurable characteristics. So scientists do a very poor job of figuring out things like motivation, perseverance, any number of what we call broadly unmeasurable characteristics. So we don't know if these two groups are actually equal. It may be that girls who came forward for this program are a little bit more motivated. They're a little bit more conscious or thinking about making healthy choices than this comparison group that we created because they didn't come forward for the project. So it doesn't eliminate some other possible explanations for this increase in healthy choices that you're seeing in the study. Better, but not perfect. And then what you get to in the last square, I guess, is more of the experimental design that we've been referencing along the way. This idea that you would take all eligible populations for a particular intervention. Usually you only do this when you have a scarcity of resources to make it sort of ethical to deny people services. And you randomly assign them. So some of the girls get the program and some of the girls do not. And the beauty of the random assignment is that these two groups are now equal on all measurable characteristics as well as those unmeasurable characteristics. So then when you find an impact, in this case, of 50% more healthy choices, you know with greater certainty it is because of the program, because you've accounted for all other variables. So that's sort of the beauty. And that is, I have to say, when you look at What Works Clearinghouse and some of the other agencies engaged in systematic reviews, they're really heavily weighted to the more rigorous study designs, in part because you can have more confidence in the conclusions made from them. So any questions on those three little stylized examples? Yeah.
I know this is just an example, but how would you know what food choices they made? Would they know they were being watched, for example?
Well, that gets into, I mean, a lot of, this usually comes up when you survey, and survey is usually self-selected, your own answers, and are people giving you what really honestly happened or what they think you want to hear? And survey developers have ways of minimizing bias. So some of the ways that we've talked about at Helios, more in the education realm, rather than asking somebody about, actually an example from a conversation I had just this week, rather than asking somebody, you know, how do you think about early ed? Is it a system of 0 to 8? And they'd say, oh yeah, because everybody knows, you know, early ed now we're supposed to think about it as 0 to 8. Yep, that's what I think. But then if you actually ask more about behaviors, so in the last week, how many, if you're surveying kindergarten teachers, how many times have you talked to early ed providers in your communities? Once, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times. You get a better sense of actually, is that what they think, what they understand, actually validated by their behaviors. So there's ways to try to get at that. And better designs will try to look at, not rely on self-reported data, but actually have observations. But you can't always mitigate people adjusting their behavior because you're looking at them or asking. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that? A good question.
There are all kinds of, depends on what your topic is, but for example, in like with the youth risk behavior survey, where there's a lot of sexual questions with kids, you know, what are you doing sexually? Tom Horn, when he was director of the State Department then, said that when there was reports of increased sexual activity in kids, they were just bragging and it wasn't true. Well, for example, they found in some really rigorous studies, they found that given a choice between asking a kid questions, giving them a paper survey, or giving them a computer to enter responses in, that you get the most honest responses from kids entering things on a computer rather than on paper or face-to-face. And so how you structure the questionnaire, depending upon the kinds of topics and how sensitive they are, can make a huge difference.
Right, and I would just say in testing questions like that, I mean, there are, I would say, statistical adjustments to adjust for bias, but I think back to Wayne's original point about what the evidence-based practice is, that these are many of these proven models, and so some of the websites that we've given here, there's one, Perform Well, which is a recent combination with the Urban Institute, Child Trends, and a third partner, I forget, but they have a set of questions in each of those that they've tested those questions. So I think, once again, if you go back and the model is replicated appropriately, you may not have to worry about it even though you're interested in it. So if you're not necessarily conducting that type of research and developing the survey question, if it's a sound program, tried, tested, true, and perhaps proven, that work may be done for you. And I think maybe back to if the nonprofit is the researcher as well, those questions, that would be a concern where you may think about types of survey questions that they may use in a program, because then they're probably developed to show the program at its best as opposed to cover the spectrum of what may or may not be asked.
Any other questions? So I think we've already foreshadowed this slide about where can you get this kind of evidence from. I would point you to these sources, the list that we've already gotten you, and Google Scholar is just a more streamlined sort of internet database or searchable function that will be a little bit narrower than just Google. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Wayne to wrap this up.
Yeah, so as an example, within the STEM arena, there's 100K and 10 where they have this process where they're vetting programs to determine effectiveness, and then they change the equation with the STEM database. So where would those sorts of things fall on that spectrum? Because they have these rubrics and they're assessing programs and determining if they think they're going to be effective. So where would you say those would fall?
And I'm smiling because I've looked at Change the Equation, which was done by WestEd, which is one of these firms that I would say I have a high regard for. They are not as rigorous in determining what's effective as the federal agency. So they have set their bar for evidence lower. So it's more of the promising camp than it is the proven. And you can set your bar differently. I mean, one of the challenges, and I was just on a webinar with some folks from HHS, is when you go to this the most rigorous standard, you might have the chance of eliminating all studies and all programs and not coming forward with anything that seems suggesting that it might be effective. And it's not that programs that only have promising evidence aren't effective. We just don't know at this point. So it seems, and especially in the STEM field, because I've worked with Joanne, there isn't a lot of evidence about STEM interventions, of rigorous evidence. So if you were going to use that as your gatekeeper, no one's getting through the door. So you need, and you don't want to do that for the field, so you do want to let some of these promising ones and combine that with that evidence building strategy so that hopefully the whole field of STEM can advance. And I'm not sure if Change the Equation does have an evidence building agenda along with its sort of more clearinghouse style activities. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, if nothing else, asking potential grantees, why should we believe that this will work? Be a very powerful question. It could be something as simple as some logic, sort of makes sense. We've got evidence, but often when you get a deer in the headlights look, when you ask, why should we believe this will work, that suggests that they may not be relying a lot on evidence. A lot of this is sort of like religion. We believe it because we believe it. And faith is fine, but evidence helps. Now, when you're assessing evidence, as Patsy said, the more up-to-date the spectrum is, the better. And you look at the evidence continuum. The bottom line on all of this is, if I could just stress one thing, in terms of applicability to funders, is in the whole area of what to fund, there's an opportunity cost. If you fund one thing, you may not be funding another thing. And if you have to bet what's going to have the most impact in the community, when you got a choice, when you have to make a choice, go with the things that have evidence to suggest they're more likely to work. Sexy can be interesting, sexy can be fun, can also be highly ineffective. And so sometimes the old tried and true boring interventions can be the ones that are most likely to be effective. But at a minimum, when you're reviewing your grant requests, ask your grantees and ask yourself, why should we believe this will work? And based on the responses you get and the reflections you have about the credibility of the intervention, help use that to guide you in terms of what your decisions are. Any questions?
Wayne, I have a question.
Yeah.
Has Piper funded any examples that would fit into the innovation category? And if so, what might you have learned from those investments?
Well, yeah, we've funded stuff that was a crapshoot, but we did it knowing it was a crapshoot, hopefully. There aren't good models for everything.
Right.
And innovation makes the most sense when there's a dearth of really highly effective interventions. That's when innovation makes sense. And it isn't that there's nothing that works. For example, within medicine, there's steady progress where you build on what's known, and then there's kind of wacky innovation. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, for example, in cancer, there were people who said, go to Mexico and have Laetrile injections. Laetrile was peach pit and apricot pit derivatives. And you got cancer, shoot yourself up with apricots. Steve McQueen died. For those of you who are much younger, you know, remember Steve McQueen? But Steve McQueen died in Mexico being treated for cancer with coffee enemas. Those are innovations that are what desperate people turn to. That's different than innovation that builds on the field. You know certain things work, it logically follows this might work, so let's try this. That's different than an innovation of, well, let's just have a crapshoot and pull something wild out and see if it'll work. Yeah.
You're using the term intervention, and it sounds like you're using it synonymously with evidence-based practice.
Mm-mm. I think
What
the
do you
best.
what do you mean by intervention?
But I guess what I'm saying by intervention is you got a problem and you want to address the problem, okay? And as a funder, it's like programs, okay? You want to reduce dropout rates. So whatever it is that you do to reduce the dropout rate is the intervention. Some interventions have evidence behind them.
Oh.
Some just are somebody's bright or not so bright idea, depending on how clever the person is. And there's nothing wrong with bright ideas. But the more the bright ideas are rooted in evidence of what works, better off you are taking a shot at it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll be around. Oh, go ahead.
What would be an example of a non-sexy intervention that happens to work that you guys fund?
Well, I think one example I gave already was it's clear that premature babies having opportunity in a NICU is likely to have increased outcomes, increased beneficial health outcomes for premature babies. That's clear. That's research-based. That's evidence-based practice. The communities that have NICUs have much better outcomes with premature babies than communities that don't have NICUs. So we invested in expanding the number of NICU beds in the community. That's pretty non-sexy, but it works.
I would just add, we had an interesting dialogue about this topic in planning the session, and I'm advancing a view for government and its relationship to philanthropy, and I'm not saying it currently happens, we have some, maybe it's starting to happen, but the idea would be philanthropy could invest in things that don't have the rigorous evidence base, the proven, the highest quality of evidence behind it. To start, because in a lot of fields there isn't a lot of evidence. We don't know what works for all populations. So trying to ignite some of that additional innovation, smart innovation, innovation based on what's come before. And then once sort of the practices do accumulate more evidence, our government should be more in the habit of funding things that are effective. And so in some ways, you can get behind this, beyond this question of big government, small government, it's effective government through the use of evidence and through the use of scaling what works. I don't think we're there. I think there's certain federal agencies. So for example, HHS through its home nursing, home visiting program, its teen pregnancy has moved in this direction. Of 75% of its funding is going to things that have been proven, only 25% going to organizations or programs that don't have the evidence base. Social Innovation Fund, Invest in Innovation Funds, these things you might have heard that's the start of government, and that actually started under Bush in some regards, so it's not a Democrat-Republican sort of thing. So that's where I would love to see us go, is that Piper doesn't have to invest in the NICU beds. Government should be doing that because we know it works.
And the federal government is typically much more open to data-based and evidence-based practices than some state governments, which are much more ideological and much less data-driven. They won't remain nameless.
I've been interested in a couple of evaluation reports that I've seen lately that...
Can everyone hear Nancy?
No.
Just want to make sure.
The reports that I've seen recently that had really wonderful titles, like this was about to be the best thing since sliced bread. And then you read the report, parts of it, and you realized that it was very poorly implemented. So they had 5 sites in 5 cities, and 4.5 out of 5 implemented it poorly, so they spent millions of dollars on rigorous evaluation and had absolutely nothing to say. And that is just a travesty that discourages people from doing this kind of work that is so desperately needed.
I think implementation is the key, and I think it's adjusting factors that perhaps should not be adjusted. And so there is a report out recently that that came out in the last month that perhaps foundations should invest in some of this as well. I think that's a heavy burden again to put on foundations because that's expensive work, but I think that the key is really to think about process and implementation, and if there is a proven practice and the model is really not followed and it's poorly implemented, then of course you won't achieve the intended outcome. And the report then talks about, well, what failed or doesn't.
And the funders failed in these couple of instances because they obviously weren't keeping track of what was being done.
Failure's not always a bad thing, though. I mean, there's a lot to be learned from failure, and I think lessons learned.
Success is better, though.
No, I agree success is better, but I think there are lessons from failure.
When it is so basic from, point A to point B, then you think success is
One of the rules of philanthropy is providing risk capital. An agency wants to try a new model. An agency wants to expand. They can't afford failure. They'll go out of business. And so we provide the risk capital to allow them to take a chance they otherwise couldn't take. But there's a difference between risk capital, investing in things that are likely to work, and a crapshoot. And I guess what I'm saying is avoid the crapshoots and make investments that have some reason behind them.
I just want to raise a really great point that I think is overlooked, and I think evaluators and researchers have to take this on too, is we get so obsessed with causality, with does it work, that
Are
we
we
forget.
really moving the needle, or is it just moving on its own?
Yes, that we neglect issues of implementation. And I think this has been, in the last year of being here, working with grantees, is understanding what is it that you're changing? How is this different than what's happened before? Really kind of trying to work with them up front to articulate what it is, and then as they go to implement, actually documenting how the design differs from what actually happens, and knowing what that is, because it's so integral to replication. If you can't describe what the dosage was, what the frequency was, what activities actually occurred, how can anyone else do it? And I think that doing good, rigorous implementation, which sometimes is somewhat more weighted to qualitative work. We haven't advanced the methodology as much as we could around getting better at both documenting what happens and also then helping sites actually deliver on it. I mean, the studies I worked on before I came here, implementation, variation in implementation was the thing that knocked us down, and we didn't, in one big study I spent 3 years looking at, we didn't have impacts.
And
And in
that's
part because
technical
of-
assistance. too.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's, can also be expensive depending on if you're a Piper Foundation versus a corporate foundation versus government.
I briefly did some review work for What Works, when I was in Baltimore. And sometimes it's not the intervention that makes the difference. It's the passionate people who are working in a project. And sometimes they could be doing tiddlywinks. It's the personal qualities of the people who are emotionally invested, who are very good at working with people. And that's real difficult to transfer. You can't put effective people through a Xerox machine and transplant them all across the country. And so one of the things that the better clearinghouses do is try and disentangle, is it the intervention or is it the passion of the people working the programs? But that's another issue to think about when you're looking at evaluation results.